Friday, monsters! So glad you could join us for today's episode. These weekly episodes also serve as weekly meetings for our very own true crime cult.
That's right. We started a cult so that all of our spooky friends have a place to go for nonstop creepy content. But never fear, you've landed in a cult with all the adorable baby goats and none of the police standoffs.
In case you're just joining us for the very first time today, allow us to introduce ourselves. I'm Angelina, and I'm here with my bewitching bestie, Aurora. How was your week?
Pretty solid. Just getting ready for a big move to the Canary Islands, which I'm quite excited about.
A very exciting move.
Yes.
Yeah, finally some sort of like vacation-y destination where you can feel like you're having not just one more stressful international move, but like
warm,
a fun, relaxing
weather
time.
at the beach.
Hang out by the water. Yeah. Very nice.
Yes. And how about you and your week?
My week is my week is pretty nondescript. I joined Poshmark, and now we're selling off a whole bunch of vintage clothes because we've been hoarding vintage clothing and shoes for years, and now it's time to like turn that into a hustle of sorts, I guess. So
I like that.
My new shop. If anyone's into vintage clothes, hit me up, and I'll forward you our link. But yeah, otherwise pretty non-eventful. I did notice your post about the puppy meetup, though, which I want to talk about. How are those puppies doing?
Oh, yeah.
Your pup date.
Yeah. So for just to catch anyone up around Halloween of last year, I was contacted by a French bulldog rescue group from the UK that rescues dogs in Hungary that need help. And a mom had 5 puppies on Halloween, and the terrible breeders that had her didn't realize that French bulldogs can't have vaginal births, and they were trying to cut corners. So she ended up in a shelter. They just dropped her off while she was giving birth. She almost died. Puppies almost died. And, fortunately, we were able to take them in, having no idea what we were doing. My husband and I decided to care for them and had them for a couple months, a couple of the most joyous, sleep-deprived months of my entire life. And we found...
And they all got spooky names because they were like Halloween babies.
Yes. And so they all went to homes around Christmas and are now in their forever homes. And we had a big reunion at a park on Sunday, and I got to see them all for the first time in quite some time. And they hadn't seen each other since they were like little babies. So it was great to...
A puppy family reunion.
Yes, it was so happy.
Very nice. We should put some pics of that in our newsletter.
Oh, yeah.
For any patrons that are into it. Why not?
Yeah, we'll upload those pup dates in our Patreon this weekend.
Yeah.
Well, it's fun to imagine yourself as an honorary cult member as you listen to our show. But if you'd like to make it official, you can join the MMN commune on Patreon. You'll find us at patreon.com/MurderMurderNews. To show you how much we appreciate your monthly pledge, we'll give you a shout out on the show, your own official title like Grandmaster of Goats, and you'll have exclusive access to our special patron-only content like our monthly special video episodes. Tune in at the end of April to see the episode we're working on right now, which will likely be April Fool's hijinks.
Can't wait. So let's kick things off with some of the true crime stories that made headlines this week.
In Philadelphia, police are searching for a man they believed killed his girlfriend and her unborn baby at a gas station. 31-year-old Tamara Cornelius spoke with her boyfriend, Rafiq Thompson, last Friday before she went to dinner at the Cheesecake Factory. Authorities believe Rafiq waited outside while she had dinner and then followed her to an Exxon gas station. When she got to the gas station, Rafiq got out of his car to talk to her and then allegedly shot her multiple times. Tamara died shortly after at a hospital. The DA is offering a $5,000 reward to anyone who can provide investigators with information leading to Rafiq's arrest. And if you have any information about his whereabouts, please call the Montgomery County Detectives at 610-226-5553.
A California mother has been arrested for drowning her 2 sons in a bathtub last week. Police responded to a 911 call after 26-year-old Courtney Williams' husband returned home from work, and she told him she had hurt their children. When police arrived at their home in Yuba, the 2 boys were found dead in the bathtub. Courtney was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of her 2 children, 5-month-old Holden and 2-year-old Ronan, on Monday. Now, before we get into our story, we just want to say that while our tone is light in the intro, we do take the topics we're discussing very seriously. We are best buds and we love chatting together every week and turning it into a podcast. We want to share that passion with you and to create a vibe where all of you feel like our best buds too. We joke about us friends forming a cult or commune, but that's not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, which we do occasionally talk about in our weekly stories. We feel it's important to open up and talk about even the darkest aspects of humanity and the downright scary things that come up in the news. But we want to make it clear that our intention is never to sensationalize, and we always try to deliver these stories with respect to all parties involved or affected by the crimes we discuss.
We always post our sources in the episode description, so you can do some digging on your own if a story we present piques your interest. But you should know that if you ever feel we get it wrong, either in our tone or in the details of the case, we want to hear about it. We are more than happy to make a correction or give an update on a case we've discussed in previous episodes. So feel free to reach out to us at murdermurdernews@gmail.com.
Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include graphic descriptions of violence, domestic violence, sexual assault of children, and child murder. If any of those are particularly sensitive subjects for you, feel free to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
So I came across today's case while researching crimes that inspired horror movies last Halloween. And on the surface, this murder seemed to be a cabin in the woods sort of scenario where a family was staying in the woods and then they were found all murdered. But upon digging a little deeper, it's not what I thought it was at all. This week in true crime history, 3 people were found murdered in Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort in Keddie, California in 1981, and a 4th person from the cabin was kidnapped and found murdered years later. The case is still unsolved to this day and inspired the movies The Strangers, which is basically like a home invasion sort of horror movie with Liv Tyler, and a newer movie called Cabin 28, which I've not seen but got very bad reviews on IMDb. So our sources for today include a documentary by Tuesday 28, an episode of People Magazine Investigates on ID, an episode of Murder Squad, Plumas News, and more. And we've included a full list of all of our sources in our show notes. In November of 1980, 36-year-old Glenna Susan Sharp, who went by Sue, left her abusive husband, James, and moved their 5 kids from Connecticut to Quincy, California, to be closer to her brother, Don. James had been in the Navy while Sue stayed home with the kids, but his violent behavior and sexual abuse of their 2 daughters led Sue to seek a fresh start. The family moved to a trailer in Quincy, but the space was too small for the family of 6, and they ultimately moved 7 miles away to a cabin in Keddie, California. The Keddie Resort had once been a vacation destination, but by the 1980s, the cabins were in a state of disrepair and were rented out long-term to what was kind of seen as lower-income community.
Sue worked hard to make ends meet as a single mother. She received $250 a month from the Navy, plus food stamps and welfare. She was also enrolled in a federal education program that gave her money to attend classes at the local community college, where she was taking business classes and really wanted to make a better life for her kids. But in the 1980s, there was a lot of classism and negativity towards single mothers. Neighbors gossiped about Sue being on welfare, and many said she was in sex work, selling drugs, and entertaining boyfriends at all hours of the day. Many believed she was, at the very best, an unfit mother. According to her daughter Sheila, those rumors were all completely untrue, and Sue was a hardworking mom who mostly kept to herself. In her book, How to Survive Your Visit to Earth, Sheila said of Sue, quote, "She was a kind and loving mother who was doing her very best to raise 5 children alone. She was dutiful in her attention to each of us, and while we lived in relative poverty, we also lived in a home of love. My mother's kindness and grace also extended beyond her own family, which may have ultimately been her downfall."
When the family moved into Cabin 28, space was a little bit tight. The cabin had 2 bedrooms and a basement, and Sue's oldest, 15-year-old John, slept in the basement, while 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg shared one bedroom, and Sue, 14-year-old Sheila, and 12-year-old Tina shared the other bedroom. The kids all made friends in their new neighborhood, and other than the gossiping neighbors, things seemed to be going pretty well for the family. Sue hoped to one day open a small business. The kids had space to play, and they were all making their new lives work. On April 11th, 1981, the day started like any other. The kids all had plans to play with their friends around town. Sheila and Tina were over at Cabin 27 playing with the Seabolt's daughter, Alicia, who was Sheila's best friend. Rick and Greg had their friend, 12-year-old Justin from Cabin 26, over to ride bikes and stay the night. Justin happened to be the stepson of one of the prime suspects in the murder, but we'll come back to that a little later. The oldest son, John, had been with his 17-year-old friend, Dana Wingate, and the two had gone to Quincy, which is, again, 7 miles away, to look for a party. It seems like the boys both had permission from Sue and Dana's foster mom to go to the party, and there's a little murkiness to the story here. Some say Sue told the boys they could go as long as they didn't hitchhike home, and some say Dana was told not to hitchhike by his foster mom. Either way, it seems like they completely tossed that out of the window and did it anyways, as the boys were seen hitchhiking that evening around 9 p.m.
Around the same time, Tina came home from playing at the Seabolt's in Cabin 27. Alicia's mom really wanted her to have some time alone with Sheila since the girls had gotten so close. Sheila stayed over at the Seabolt's, and they stayed up talking and watching TV. Rick and Greg had their friend Justin stay over, and at some point, John and his friend Dana arrived back at Cabin 28 as well. The Sharp family would have other visitors that night. According to Marilyn Lockwood, she had stopped by Cabin 28 on the 11th. Marilyn lived in Cabin 26 with her husband Marty Smart and her son Justin, who we already mentioned was staying with the Sharp boys. Marilyn also had a daughter, but she had recently moved to Oregon to stay with her father because Marty made her feel unsafe. On the night of April 11th, Marty had a friend staying in town, John Beau Boubide, who went by Beau. Marty and Beau knew each other from a VA hospital. Marilyn said the three of them had planned to head down to Keddie Backdoor Bar for drinks. And Marty suggested she invite Sue so Beau could have a date. Marilyn insisted that Sue wouldn't want to come since she didn't drink alcohol, but Marty insisted and Marilyn relented. She went to ask Sue, but Sue didn't want to go. There are also rumors that Beau had hit on Sue many times and that she had continuously turned him down. Nonetheless, Marilyn, Marty, and Beau went to the bar together that night, and Marilyn says she ended up going to bed on the earlier side, around 11. The next morning, the Seabolts invited Sheila to go to church with them, so she ran home to get a change of clothes. When she got back to her house at 7:45 a.m., all appeared to be quiet. The lights were out, the curtains were drawn. Sheila opened the door to her worst nightmare. There was blood everywhere. She saw 3 bodies bound with electrical cords. She scanned the room, but the bodies were hard to recognize, and she couldn't tell who was dead in the room. She remembered thinking the killer could still be inside. She was so startled that she dropped her clothes and sleeping bag outside and went running back to the Seabolts. The Seabolts didn't have a phone, so the mom went to the owner of the resort to get help calling the sheriff.
In the meantime, the Seabolts' oldest son, Jamie, went to scout the house to see if anyone was alive inside needing help. Again, they thought there was a possibility that the killer was still there, so Jamie started by walking around the perimeter of the house, quietly peeking in the windows. When he got to Rick and Greg's room, he saw the 3 boys were still inside of their room, seemingly unharmed. He was able to wake Rick, Greg, and Justin and help them out of the window. They'd been in the house sleeping the whole time. The sheriff and Sue's brother, Don, arrived at the cabin, and Don struggled to ID John, Sue, and Dana. The crime scene was horrific. John was closest to the door with his wrists and ankles bound with electrical cord, which had been found in their home, and medical tape. His throat had been slit, he had been stabbed multiple times, and he had several skull fractures from a hammer. Sue's body was found next to the couch, nude from the waist down. She had a blood-soaked yellow blanket covering her body that appeared to be placed after her death. She had been stabbed multiple times in her chest and throat, had lacerations and bruises to her face, fractures of her teeth, and cuts on both of her hands. She had also been bound with electrical cord and medical tape, and had been gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear with her mouth taped shut. There was no sign of sexual assault, though some have pointed out that forensics in the 80s would not have been as evolved as forensics today. The murder squad with Paul Holes mentioned that Sue was found with blood smeared on her thighs, but it was unclear from the crime scene photos if that could have come from the attacker or if it was possible she was crawling in a spot where blood was already on the ground.
Between John and Sue, Dana was found beaten with a hammer, face down on a sofa pillow. His wrists and ankles were bound with electrical cord and medical tape, though one report mentions his hands and feet were not bound, but had been wrapped with the electrical cord as though the binding had come loose. Dana also had lacerations and bruising with blunt force trauma, but his cause of death was manual strangulation. Many detectives involved in the case have mentioned there were stab marks on the walls, which seemed to maybe indicate the killer or killers was having a psychotic break. Paul Holes also pointed out that this could have been a sign of a struggle. The attacker could have been trying to stab one of the victims, and the victim managed to slip away, causing the attacker to stab the wall. 2 knives and a hammer were found at the cabin. One of the knives was a steak knife from the cabin's kitchen, and it had been stabbed with such force that it bent the blade back. Investigators believe a second hammer was used at the crime scene, but was not found. Police believe from the beginning that there were likely 2 assailants. It must have been a challenge to subdue and bind 2 teenage boys and a woman. Dana was 17, and though John was only 15 and not a super big guy, his sister Sheila described him as feisty.
So let's come back to the 3 boys who had been in the house alive the whole time. 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg reportedly slept through the entire ordeal, but the story from their friend, 12-year-old Justin, was a little different. He said he had slept through the attack at first, but it appeared that it was possible he had seen more than he knew and might be repressing his memories of the attack. Police first interviewed Justin on April 12th in a police car. Justin kept saying to the officer, "Where is Tina? Tina is missing." Indeed, 12-year-old Tina was nowhere to be found, and the only trace of her was a sheet in her room with a small amount of blood on it. Investigators were desperate to find Tina, and the FBI was called in right away. Tina was really adored by the community. She was small for her age, and teachers and friends recalled how lovely she was with piercing eyes and a sweet personality. With Tina now missing, investigators questioned the motive of the crime. The community had initially believed that the target of the attack was Sue, with lots of victim blaming and slut-shaming flying around. We've mentioned there were rumors Sue was a sex worker or a drug dealer, but drugs were not found in the systems of any of the victims or in the house, and it sounds like it really was just rumors. Was Sue really the target, or was it Tina?
At one point during the investigation, John Douglas of Mindhunter fame was actually called in to do a profile of the killer. He believed the murderer was motivated by a love for Tina. At this point in the investigation, the number 1 suspect for police became James Sharp, Sue's ex-husband. As we mentioned, James had been molesting his 2 daughters, according to their oldest daughter, Sheila. Police followed James, hoping he would lead them to Tina, who had been his favorite daughter. But soon they found that James had a rock-solid alibi and was nowhere near Keddie on the night of the murder. They removed James from their list of suspects, but Tina was still missing. Investigators then looked into anyone else who could have been close to Tina. Tina had been in special education classes at school, and her special ed teacher, Joel Lipsy, had a strange fixation on her. He had a picture of her on his desk at school and another at home. He had also been at the Keddie backyard bar the night of her family's murder. He had an alibi at the time they were likely killed, but he later went on to be arrested for molesting another one of his students in a different town. Nonetheless, he was removed as a suspect.
With no other suspects related to the disappearance of Tina, investigators were back to square one. There was no denying that this attack felt very personal. It had been so incredibly violent, and the attack on Sue with her pants being removed, but also being covered by a blanket, did raise the question if she was the target and Tina had just been a distraction. One other mystery that confounded the police was how the three boys had remained safe, unharmed, and possibly so unbothered during the attack that they managed to sleep through the whole thing. Was it possible that the attacker knew the boys and cared for them enough to leave them alone? The sheriff was hopeful that the boys might remember more than they said. Rick and Greg really did seemingly sleep through the whole thing, but Justin seemed to know more. The sheriff used hypnotherapy with him not long after the murder. While hypnotized, Justin reported that they'd been watching Love Boat before bed, and he had a dream that there were two men on a boat and they fought with John and Dana, throwing them overboard. A man had a pocket knife and stabbed Sue, but she wasn't the first one to be stabbed. In this dream, Tina woke up after hearing a struggle, and one of the men ran outside with Tina and came back without her. He also recalled seeing the hammer. He described the two men he saw, one with short hair and one with long hair. The dream was clearly quite surreal, but did parallel the actual attack that had taken place that night. Justin's witness testimony was admittedly confusing, but he was a 12-year-old who had possibly witnessed something incredibly horrific and was trying to recall it while under hypnosis, a technique which we no longer use today. In modern interviews, Justin is still not sure if he saw the attack or if he walked around the crime scene afterwards, allowing him to have more insight about what might have happened and then sort of incorporated it into this dreamlike trance when he was hypnotized.
A composite artist was able to work with Justin to come up with drawings of the two men he had seen in his dream. One of the drawings looked eerily similar to Justin's stepfather, Marty Smart, who lived next door to the Sharps and had wanted to invite Sue out that evening. Marty did not have a great reputation around town. He had PTSD from being a soldier during Vietnam and was known for being aggressive. Sheila remembers him as having a dislike for her older brother, John, and there are plenty of stories about him being abusive towards his family from ex-wife Marilyn and friends of their family. We mentioned earlier that Marilyn's daughter had actually moved out of the house to live with her father to get away from Marty. Marilyn has also shared a story about a time not long after the murder when Justin was playing in his room with a friend. Justin was acting out a stabbing scenario with his friend when Marty came in and started yelling at Justin. According to Marilyn, Marty threatened Justin to never mention stabbing or the murders ever again. Marilyn and Justin have both shared stories of Marty's abuse, and at one point in their marriage, Marty allegedly tried to run them over with a car. Marty had checked himself into the VA hospital to deal with mental health issues, and that's when he met his friend Beau. Beau had a long criminal history as a hitman and a thief and had been in and out of jail.
So let's come back to what we know about Marty and Beau and the night of the murders. According to Marilyn, Marty's wife, the three had invited Sue out for a drink, and Sue had declined. Marilyn then went home and went to bed at 11 p.m. Some reports say that Marty and Beau went home with Marilyn and then came back out to the bar later, and some say they stayed out at the bar and Marilyn went home alone. Marilyn then said she woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of Marty and Beau burning something in their wood stove. Marilyn has also revealed that police found a jacket they believed to be Tina's at their home, but that evidence either didn't exist or came up missing. Police interviewed Marty and Beau, and their testimonies were interesting. Beau told police that he was a former cop, which was not true, and that he had once been shot while working, causing him to be impotent. He used this as a reason as to why he couldn't be interested in Sue. His alibi was that he was with Marty at a bar, and then the investigation took a very interesting turn. Marty and Beau were interviewed together at the same time, something that isn't done for obvious reasons to anyone who has ever seen a police drama.
During the interrogation, Marty said that his stepson, Justin, could have been at the scene of the crime without having detected him, which seemingly was a strange way of suggesting that he had actually been at the crime scene. He then went on to describe a hammer that had been missing from his home, and we already know that police believe 2 separate hammers were used at the murder. Even with these odd statements, Marty and Bo are cleared by the sheriff and never interviewed again. There are a few theories as to why this may have been. One theory is that Bo was an informant, reporting details about a larger crime to the organized crimes unit. Another theory was that Marty was friends with the sheriff and that the sheriff was strategically holding back evidence that could have implicated Marty and Bo. One officer was told to stay away from the case or he would be fired. Bo and Marty moved away from the Keddie area, and without any new movement such as finding Tina or the missing hammer, the case went cold. Then fast forward 3 years to April 22nd, 1984. Ronald Petrini was out collecting recyclables in Feather Falls in Butte County, 60 miles from Keddie, when he found a human skull. The skull was brought to a professor at Chico University to determine whether or not it was prehistoric. It wasn't uncommon to find human remains in the area that were occasionally from prehistoric indigenous nations. So the original intent was to determine who was the owner so it could be returned. The professor guessed that the skull was that of an 11 or 12-year-old child and said it looked like it had not been sitting in the elements for long. It was not badly eroded, hadn't been sitting in the sun, and didn't look as though it had been buried. The cause of death could not be determined, but he guessed the person had been dead for 1.5 to 2 years.
Shortly after the discovery, the county received an anonymous call stating it was the skull of Tina Sharp. Dental records confirmed that this was the case, and when investigators returned to where the skull had been found, the scene had already been tampered with. In yet another big blow to this case, the recording of the anonymous caller, along with all the copies of the recording, disappeared. It's believed that whoever made the call was involved in Tina's murder. It's unknown how long Tina was kept alive after she was taken from her home. Initially, the professor thought she had been dead for 1.5 to 2 years, but he also admitted it can be hard to tell how long she had decomposed given the way she was found. Based on his original estimate that the skull was that of an 11 or 12-year-old child, it's possible she was killed right away. In 1998, Bo passed away and Marty died in 2000. Sheila and her family had pretty much given up hope of the murders being solved at this point. In 2010, a new sheriff was elected and had invested interest in the case as he was actually friends with the Sharp kids when they were children. He reopened the Keddie murders. Investigators noticed that Marty had been going to a therapist at the VA and reached out to that therapist. Allegedly, Marty had confessed to the murders weeks later after the murders. He told the therapist he killed the woman and the daughter, but didn't have anything to do with the boys. He also said he had incapacitated and killed Tina to get rid of a witness. He had supposedly done it because he blamed Sue for his marriage with Marilyn ending. Marilyn left Marty right after the murder for pretty obvious reasons, and she definitely thinks he's guilty. While re-examining the evidence, they also found a letter from Marty written to Marilyn that she had previously handed over to authorities, but nobody seems to have examined. The letter said the following.
Dear Marilyn, first off, you know that I haven't tried to hurt you with my letters. I'm writing this after our phone call Monday, April 27th. Marilyn, there's 2 things I want you to know. The first is that I love you, and I don't care what has happened. Now is the time to start over. Call now. You don't know how much I suffered before I met you. I asked God to send me someone who would care for me. I thought he sent you. I remember the hour, the words that were said. I said your phone number 1,000 times that night. I've given you my heart, all of it. Please try and think back. What do you think I've paid for you? For 3 years, I've heard about your kids. Don't get me wrong, I love them too. Now I'll ask, what about mine? Don't you think I love them? Honey, I gave up 4 of the most precious things in my life. For what? For you. The answer is simple. Now I'll ask you, why should I love your kids more than mine? I've tried. That's more than you can say. I don't think you ever loved me, much less my kids. And yet you expect this from me, and I've given it to you. I've paid the price of your love. And now that I've bought it, with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through. Great. What else do you want? I've paid the price. I've given my flesh and blood for you. I'll gladly pay your bills. Just send them in. You know that I love you more than my own kids. Can you say that? I know you've given up a lot to be with me, but I don't think you know what I've paid. Yes, I'm jealous. For the price I've paid, I should be. You can't seem to understand how bad you have hurt me. I'm crawling back. Take me. I've paid for your love. Please give it back at least once. If you don't, you know you've stolen my heart and given it to the street. I love you. Think about what I've given up for you. Marty. Call me. Please don't wait till it's too late. I've given it all. What else do you want?
And of course, many have pointed out his mention of paying for her love with 4 people's lives, which does sound very damning. But it's unclear if he's referencing Sue, John, Dana, and Tina, or if he had 4 children that he had left for Marilyn because she encouraged him to leave them behind. So it's kind of unclear what he's referencing. It does seem like he had 4 kids, but that's such a weird way of saying, I have paid for your love with 4 people's lives. So in 2016, there was another potential break to the case when a man with a metal detector found a hammer while searching for his missing ring. The hammer was found in a dried up pond in Keddie and matched the description of the hammer Marty claimed was missing from his home. And that hammer, as we've been told, was being searched for any DNA evidence or any kind of evidence that could connect it to the murders or to Marty. And other than it matching the description, as far as I'm aware, years later, nothing has come from that hammer. Like, it hasn't tied them to the case, at least not like in a clear, concise way. So there have been many other suspects in the Keddie Cabin murders throughout the years, but most have since been cleared. Paul Holes even mentioned that he'd initially considered the case could be connected to the Golden State Killer, given its proximity to Sacramento and fitting the timeline of his crimes. And it's a mom at home with her kids, which also kind of fit his MO as well. Henry Lee Lucas also once confessed to the murders, but we probably all know that he just loved confessing to random murders. So as of today, this case remains cold, though it seems so very solvable, even with a purposely botched investigation by police. So that is the Keddie Cabin murders.
Wow, that was a doozy, that story. And it's absolutely unsettling that it's still considered unsolved, although it seems pretty obvious what happened. And it sounds like with proper police work and without anyone having sort of buddies involved in the crime or any sort of police negligence, you'd think that they would have, if not been able to test things at the time in the 80s, because as we mentioned, the sort of evidence collection and processing was different back then. You'd think they would have at least bagged some stuff and kept it for the future so that right now we'd be able to look back and be like, wow, it's obvious that these guys committed this crime. But it's a little suspicious that stuff is not there to do.
For sure. And it's interesting because one of the detectives that was interviewed had mentioned that this wasn't necessarily a case of negligence, but of an intentional cover-up. And I had mentioned that one of the sheriffs was close to the case, that he was friends with the kids when they were all little, before they were killed, obviously. And then another one of the sheriffs was actually working the case years ago, and he was the one that told to stop investigating the case or he would get fired.
Yeah.
So
it's a little sketchy.
This was clearly a cover-up, and it was really frustrating for many people in the community. And it's just a bummer because I think a lot of the evidence has been lost at this point. There's a lot of new I know everything's being re-examined, and I've read that there's some pieces of evidence that haven't been examined or in the process of being examined that weren't in the past that can still be used. Like, for example, the postcard that Marty sent to Marilyn, alleging that he had taken 4 lives for her. There was a postage stamp on that they were able to get his DNA from.
Wow.
So that's really good. That could go somewhere. They could potentially connect that to weapons or blood at the crime scene. It sounds like the boys had defensive wounds, and I can't remember if Sue did, but so it's possible that they could have scratched him or gotten some of his skin under their nails. So who knows what evidence could have been retained, though I know a lot of it, unfortunately, has come up missing or has been destroyed.
Yeah, damn. Well, I do hope that these kinds of unsolved cases are sort of a thing of the past as well, because like now that there's so much interest in crime and there's so many podcasters and like TV shows and just like citizen detectives and like web sleuths, like hopefully it'll be a lot harder to sweep this stuff under the rug and sort of deliberately botch investigations if people won't let it go. I'm hoping that like this kind of attitude towards true crime does kind of phase that shit out, because that I don't want to see any more of that. Terrible.
Yeah, unfortunately, I am sure that it still happens, but it would be great if it happened less.
Yeah, at least. So what have you been watching this week?
The only thing I really had time to watch that was true crimey this week was the documentary I mentioned in my TikTok. It's Jimmy Savile, a British horror story, a documentary on Netflix about a British man who is like a TV personality, but he's like this beloved personality from everybody's childhood. He did fundraising for hospitals. He was on everybody's favorite TV show where he like granted wishes to children and like, I don't know, all this like he sounds like he's just this amazing human, but he was actually molesting hundreds of children along the way.
Awful.
And yeah, it's interesting because it's a case I'd never heard about. I think from what I've gathered from comments on our TikTok that like pretty much if you're British, you know all about this. You know who this guy is. You know about this break in the story years ago. But I can say me as an American, I don't know about you as a Canadian, I had never heard about this ever. Yeah. So I don't know. It's a really interesting story, very poorly told. This documentary.
Yeah. I feel like after watching your review of it on TikTok, I am not really inclined to watch because I'm not interested in like a Jimmy Savile puff piece where it's like 3/4 of the show are just like talking about all the cool things he did. That's not really an important feature to highlight at this point, now that we know that he's a prolific abuser and criminal.
Yeah.
So gross. I just kept thinking like, there are other disgraced TV personalities. And imagine we did a movie about Cosby where we spent an hour and a half talking about all of his cool accomplishments in life. Like that would be really disturbing, unsettling. I'm not here for it. So I'm not sure I'll watch this one, but it is interesting. Like you mentioned, it's interesting, important to mention sort of where he's coming from, because obviously it's a place of privilege where everyone respects him so much that it's easy for him to get away with this shit. But you could still tell that part of the story in 20 minutes. So
yeah, I would have liked to have, obviously that's important, and not knowing who he was, I needed that insight to understand why he was so beloved. But I just would have liked to have heard from more survivors for longer. And also like, I heard a little bit on our TikTok that some of those cases are still closed because they're investigating, so not everybody can come forward.
Wow.
Okay, but I think we can still tell them from sort of like an anonymous perspective. Like there's definitely a way to work that in and still do it in a like telling way, so we understand like the breadth of his crimes. Like that's what I was there for, like to hear from survivors.
Yeah, and if not hearing from survivors directly, like you had mentioned to me, like just like the writing and the sort of the planning of this show coming from the perspective of someone who maybe has experience with being a victim in these situations might have had a better angle to tell the story, even if they weren't involved in this specific case, like just like you mentioned, a lot of these shows are produced by just like white cis men that are just like TV exec dudes, and like maybe they aren't the best voice for stories like this. But
yeah, agreed.
I watched this horror movie called The Boy Behind the Door, which is allegedly loosely based on a story that a case that went down during Nazi occupation in Europe. But there was nothing about Nazis in the movie. There wasn't really any background info whatsoever. And by the end of the movie, I couldn't tell which boy they were talking about, or if there was a boy behind any door, or what exact, just like a weird, it was like a half-cocked movie plan that somehow came to be. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you just like watching a cheesy movie that you expect to be bad, which I get in that vibe for horror for sure. And that's probably what I was thinking when I turned this one on. So
yeah, for sure. My bar for horror movies is very low. Like I'm very easily entertained by the horror genre.
Cheesy and bad,
so I don't need it to be a piece
good.
of art.
Yeah, exactly. And crime-wise, I started watching the show, The Thing About Pam on Amazon Prime, which was recommended to us by our friend and monster, Tom, who mentioned that it was a bit sensational, maybe. I'm not sure I would use the word sensational to describe it, but it's definitely off, like a bit weird.
Yeah.
It's like it comes across kind of sitcom-y, kind of like comedic, a bit dark, but like it definitely comes across more like this is how they treat fictional stories. And this is a real story. So like, I dig it in a way. I think it's cool that it's
tone, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like I think it's cool to make something totally different, to make a true crime show that's got a different vibe. But if you're going to go with this angle, which is a bit lighter, maybe change everyone's name so that we don't connect it to any specific
more like
real
lifestyle.
crime.
Lifetimes. I mean,
lifetime movies.
movie.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
because this is not what we want with like factual descriptions of evidence and crime scenes. We don't want a fluffy. And the lead is Renee Zellweger, who looks nothing like herself. Almost thought it was Jennifer Coolidge, and
I love
so
Jennifer
that was
Coolidge.
surprising. But yeah, it's disappointingly not. It's Renee Zellweger, who's not as great.
Yeah, and I've never had a problem with Renee Zellweger. Like, I like her movies. I like Chicago,
She's
whatever.
Fine.
But like,
she's just not like amazing to me. But
yeah, I just think it's really inappropriate in 2022 to have someone in a fat suit. Like, there's so many fat actresses that would have loved that role. I'm sure.
That. At first, I thought maybe, that's how she looks and whatever. But if like she's wearing a fat suit, that is absolutely despicable. I don't think we need to be doing that in 2022, because if it's not important to the story that the character is a fat person, then just hire whatever actor. If it is somehow important to the story or you want to go for realism, hire a fat actor. There's plenty of those.
For sure.
Plenty of great ones.
Absolutely.
So,
I would have much rather seen that. So
I don't want to see any more fat suits.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have not seen it yet, but I did just finish the podcast this week. And have you listened to that yet?
Have not.
Well, it is interesting. I think like maybe kind of similar vibes to the show. I felt like the tone was a little weird. Like, I don't want to say anything too bad about it because it's narrated by Keith Morrison from Dateline, whom I absolutely adore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Keith Morrison, like all the credit, like Dateline's one of my all-time favorites.
So at least the narration was soothing and, classic.
Yeah, like his voice is just fantastic as always, but it felt like they were doing this sort of weird like narrative, like it was Desperate Housewives, like when the woman who was like died is like telling the story in this kind of like
there's totally a bit of that in the show.
Hitting you over the head sort of way, like just not enough trust in the listener to understand and like follow along. Like it was just a little too obvious, like But Pam didn't do that, did she? All this like weird, I don't know. The vibe was a little weird for me. With all that being said, I did still listen to every single episode of it and I finished it. And like the story is certainly very engaging.
And I feel like I'll probably watch the rest of the show too, because it is interesting and it is different. But I like review wise, I would do it a little differently. Yeah. Probably.
For sure.
But yeah, I think I'd like to check out the podcast too, because with the addition of Keith Morrison, it's probably a little bit more.
I'm sure better.
Got a bit more going for it. Yeah.
And we also wanted to give a shout out to my friend Crystal, who let us know she appreciated our episode last week about the Monster of Florence. Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate you listening. And it's always so nice to get like positive feedback from friends, because I'm always hesitant to tell friends what we do because I'm so embarrassed to hear my own voice.
And if they find out and they're like, oh, I heard your show. You're like, what are you going to say next? Like, so it's nice to hear positive feedback. That's cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. But maybe this week you're feeling like you need just a little bit more murder. If so, you know you can always find us on the OG MurderMurder.news for the latest breaking true crime news all week long.
You can find us on Instagram at MurderMurderNews, on TikTok at MurderMurderNews, where this week we posted about missing person Monisha Sheree Leith, and that post could definitely use a little more love. You can also find us on Twitter at Murder News, or on Facebook, you'll find our page by searching Murder Murder News.
And if you search Murder Murder News on Facebook, our little group should also pop up. You'll want to join us to stay in the loop about any upcoming virtual events and to RSVP to our next book club meeting. Our next meeting on Zoom is on May 1st, which is a Sunday, and we're reading Underground, The Tokyo Gas Attack and the Japanese Psyche by Haruki Murakami.
If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Views are so important if we want to keep the podcast alive and to keep creating creepy content catered to your interests.
Have a great week.
Bye, friends.
Bye-bye.
Murder, murder.